Hello, and welcome to Chapter 8 of The Sands Beneath the Moon, the ongoing story of a sorcerer and his travels alongside a merchant caravan. If you enjoy these videos, please give a like or comment with some of your feedback. My Substack is in the description as well, if you would like access to the written version of my work. Thank you, and please enjoy the video. In the wake of the battle against the dark beasts of Thelasama, 3 of the mercenaries from Hakal had been killed outright. Another pair were too severely wounded to possibly survive and were granted an honorable end at Skarson's blade. This left the northern chieftain with only Velif, who had a wounded arm, and 3 other warriors under his command, in addition to one woman from the desert, who had herself sustained painful, if not debilitating injuries, and of course the sorcerer Kyrus, who had not been so much as scratched during the skirmish. The warband was, by Skarson's estimate, less than half as formidable than it had been a day prior, but at the same time the task ahead seemed far less daunting. So long as Kyrus proved to be at least the equal of Thelasama, the errand they had been sent upon was as good as finished. Surprisingly, the water-carrying ox, with its lead staked down in the middle of the camp, had survived no worse off than the sorcerer was, though it was admittedly very twitchy after the experience, and the warriors walked cautiously and deliberately when they had to pass close to the previously docile animal. As Skarson went about the grim task of finishing off those who would not survive their wounds, then seeing to Velif's arm with a simple battlefield dressing, and the other 3 Northmen gathered the corpses of their fallen allies for the pyre, the warlock was looking towards the slain man-serpent with a deep frown. Kyrus, who had for obvious reasons not been asked to help move the bodies of the fallen warriors, wished he'd had a second crystal bottle along with him to collect the creature's dark blood. It was an impressive specimen, one he could have used to weave spells of great and formidable power. To the sorcerer's misfortune, such containers needed to be treated with the proper enchantments to nullify the risk of a crack forming and spilling the blood, and to prevent the blood from drying inside the bottle. Kyrus had no such time to create a second container before he had embarked upon this task, which was, to his mind, a great and wasteful shame. The warlock doubted that the warriors would linger in what was meant to be their camp for long once the bodies of their allies were burnt. Thus he helped himself to a ration of dried meat from the inside his robes, and took a sip from his water skin, while he enjoyed the opportunity for rest. How by Varsha can you eat with that stench in the air? It was the nomad's voice that broke the near silence, setting aside the sounds of bodies being dragged, which had descended over the group. She was looking at Kyrus with a disgust that was somewhat less severe than usual, yet still clearly pronounced, as she held a torn piece of her cloth garment forcefully against the bite wound in her arm to slow the bleeding. The sorcerer glanced at the woman's injured arm, then at Skarson, who was busy seeing to the wound of Velif. After a brief period of deliberation, he spoke. I suppose I'm used to the smell. The towers of the Witch Kings contain dark beasts, both living and dead. A sufficient quantity of incense can cover the stench of 1 or 2 live ones, but get a whole horde of them together, and there's no masking that. Let me see your arm. The faster we get that cleaned and bandaged, the less chance the flesh will become diseased later. Kyrus finished the small piece of dried salmon he had been eating with a generous bite, then held out one of his hands with its elongated fingers to accept her wrist. The desert woman froze as she recalled what the witchman had done to the imp when he had placed his hand upon its shoulder. Her fear of his magics and of his nature was potent, but ultimately the stories of curses and the wickedness of witches of the old heartland were less vivid a source of fear than the members of her tribe she had seen face slow deaths from diseased and rotting flesh after accidents or small skirmishes with other desert clans. She hesitantly offered Kyrus her arm, which he did not waste time in cleaning and bandaging with a surprising proficiency. Were you one of the Witch Kings? The Varshan woman asked in a cautious tone, and winced slightly as the warlock cleaned the wound with water from her water skin, and a clean cloth produced from one of his own robe's numerous hidden pockets. The question prompted a small laugh from Kyrus, as if she had just asked him something that was self-evidently ridiculous. To Kyrus, it was. Nothing so regal. I was merely another apprentice employed by a witch king known as Lycaris of the Bleeding Dusk. A favorite apprentice, but an apprentice nonetheless. I was more deeply initiated than most other sorcerers among my former master's subjects, but compared to him, I am... The sorcerer paused in his explanation and considered how to phrase the comparison while he produced a strip of bandages from his robes. In comparison to my former master, I am perhaps not a novice, but certainly not adept. It was his plan that I was to be inducted into the highest mysteries, but I ultimately lacked the stomach for it. The nomad shuddered at the idea of what this nearly inhuman creature, steeped in dark magic, might lack the stomach for. She fought the urge to recoil and yank her hand away while the witch-man finished binding the wound on her arm. The woman succeeded in maintaining her composure, but pulled the arm away rather quickly as soon as the warlock let go. Silence fell between the pair once more as Kyrus watched the Northmen set about the unenviable task of trying to burn their dead with the little fuel and kindling the group had brought with them. He suspected that they would eventually manage it, but only with a fair bit of tenacity. After several minutes spent watching the warriors' ongoing struggle, the nomad asked a third question of the Elentrian. "And you learned to treat wounds in this Witch King's service. Why? To act as a healer?" That question did not provoke a laugh from the sorcerer as her last one had. Rather, he seemed to consider it thoroughly. Gyrus did not consider the question because it was a difficult thing to answer. He considered it because he wasn't sure if the nature of the answer would upset the nomad too greatly. Eventually, he settled on more or less the full truth of the matter. Certain rituals require that the victim be kept alive for a sustained period of time, often in a less than desirable state of bodily integrity. It is a common practice in Elentria that the newly acquired apprentices, under the guidance of a more senior sorcerer, attend to the duty of keeping these unfortunate souls alive. This practice serves the dual purpose that it tests the apprentices for weakness and teaches them the basics of how to properly work with things like knives and injuries. I will admit that it was one of the least enjoyable aspects of my education. The manner in which Kyrus described the cruel and unusual practices of his people was with the same clinical and academic serenity he had used to discuss the nature of the dark beast the day prior. When the sorcerer finished speaking, an impenetrable silence fell between the two. The still nameless woman from the desert had more questions on her mind, but she was no longer certain she wanted the answers to them. The 7 remaining members of the company that had set out from Janaba a day prior moved again before dawn. Only Kyrus had been able to get any sleep as the mercenaries burned their dead and swore their oaths. The reek of foul bodies that surrounded the camp, and the rattled nerves left by the earlier attack, had rendered the nomad entirely incapable of making even an attempt at rest. The sorcerer himself only had about an hour and a half of sleep before he was hauled to his feet by Scarson and told it was time to move on. It took longer for their guide to lead them in the dark, even with the glowing rocks the band now carried with them. No one save for the sorcerer was entirely comfortable with the prospect of holding the enchanted stones, but the prospect of staying back at their camp, surrounded by the corpses and the foul odor of unnatural things, and the prospect of making their way through the desert at night without a source of illumination, were both significantly more disconcerting prospects for everyone present. When the pale sun of the morning made its first appearance over the horizon, the day's first light seemed to be captured by a gigantic red gem larger than a great northern bear, which painted the sands before the travelers the color of fresh blood over an unnatural distance. The ruby was held atop a still distant yet clearly visible tower which seemed to now glow a dark red, but had been completely impossible to spot in the darkness a few minutes before. Even the eyes of the band's Elentrian, eyes which were more accustomed to the eternal darkness of his homeland than to the light of the sun, had failed to spot the tower of a size and majesty that rivaled the greatest spires of the Hierophants of Janaba. The spectacle of the world painted in that scarlet color gave even the most hardened of warriors present pause. A few prayers or curses were muttered to the northern gods or ancestors scarcely known to those of southern lands, and even Scarson's jaw seemed to tighten as his muscles tensed and his hand found the hilt of his blade. The dim red desert, where shadows were not moved by the light of the day, seemed almost apocalyptic in its nature. The water ox, which had been calmed down when the band began to move in the early morning, had grown skittish again within the radius of the tower's unnatural glow. The mercenary who was leading the beast had to stop and come at every few dozen yards. Even as the sun rose higher, and the world should have seemed brighter, the landscape surrounding the tower remained shaded, and the shadows cast by the gem's light were unmoving. No one would have blamed the nomad woman, who was now openly reciting a prayer to her goddess, if she had attempted to run. She was the one among them who knew the way back, however, so when she looked up as though she was near to flight, Valif gripped her shoulder firmly. The act was both a promise of protection and a warning against attempting to flee. It was an action which stilled her, though failed to reassure her. The tense demeanor of all present was, of course, exacerbated by a general lack of rest. Kyrus soon discovered a slight frown had appeared on his own face. The warlock was not fond of the sun's light. One could hardly blame him, given how easily it left red burns upon his skin. And this dim light made the approach to the gem tower far more comfortable for one from the Heartland. Yet he had been operating under the assumption that the daylight approach of Thelasama's tower would be relatively safe. The assumption that the master of the Red Tower would not hold many of his deadly servants in reserve because of how much less dangerous the dark beast would be during the day now seemed tragically optimistic. The idea that the sun's light could be polluted, tainted in such a way, was not something that would occur to most Elentrians who were born under skies shrouded by an ancient curse. Even those witch lords who sought conquest beyond the borders were more concerned with the idea of blocking the sun's light than corrupting it. What was more, the way the tower had been concealed, even from his senses before being illuminated by the dawn, was not a sorcery Kyrus had ever seen on such a scale. Ultimately, he had begun to suspect that the sorcerer he was soon to come into conflict with could not have been a lone practitioner, even one of prodigious skill. This kind of magic was too intricate, too powerful, and required to complete an understanding of sorcery to be pieced together by one man alone, or even a small cabal of magic users. "Have you ever seen magic like this before, witch?" Scarson asked as his eyes roamed the many shadows cast by the dunes and the dim-colored landscape. The leader of the warriors from Akal kept one hand on the hilt of his sword, while the other gripped tightly one of the stones with a white glow Kyrus had crafted the night before. No longer were the stones of illumination being held as though they were themselves toxic. In the face of a new terror, every member of the company clung to the comparatively innocuous creations. "I can't say that I have. This sorcerer is at least a few shades more skilled than I gave him credit for," the band's own warlock admitted in a voice that was as wary as anyone present had heard from the cold-blooded Elentrian. Not quite nervous yet, but not as detached as he often seemed to be, and perhaps a bit intrigued by the nature of the tower's magic. The sand dunes became rockier as the company drew closer to the red tower. Strange shapes slithered or scuttled between outcrops and hills of rock. The creatures were swift, small, and stayed at such a distance that the light of the company's glowing stones did not reach them. Kyrus caught a glimpse of the few abominable creatures as they moved through areas between dunes where shadows of sandy hills were cast by the faint ruby light. For the other travelers, the regions were impenetrable umbral seas, but to Kyrus they were almost perfectly clear. There was an imp, not unlike the one which had struggled with their guide the night before, and there was a creature that looked like a constricting serpent, with a head that was almost that of a man. The first of the pitiful creatures was the sort of wretched specimen that Kyrus would have expected to see watching the area around any sorcerer's tower in the old Heartland. But the second represented a troubling theme to the Witchman that set a nagging suspicion about his mind as to the nature of Thelisama's research and creations. The members of the fellowship who were not Elentrians were also well aware that they weren't alone amid the scarlet and black landscape. For while the warriors and the nomads saw not the source, they heard the scuttling and the slithering in the void-like seas around them. Small beasts, relatively speaking, these ones don't present a great deal of danger to us on their own. Kyrus spoke before anyone else asked him what he saw. The sorcerer's expression was difficult for his companions to see in the light cast by the gem atop the great tower. But he was fighting to keep his mind present, instead of drifting off into speculation about the strange sorcery their enemy employed, and his fascination with the hybridization of man and serpent, demonstrated by an unsettling number of Thelisama's creations. Stay close, don't give them a chance to isolate us. Scarson's pragmatic order cut through Kyrus's wandering train of thought. The warriors, now with weapons drawn, formed a perimeter around their guide, to whom one of the Northmen handed the lead of the water ox. The protectiveness was not for any particularly chivalrous reason. It was merely due to the undeniable fact that she was their best hope of finding a way out of the desert when this errand was completed. Kyrus moved forward to the front of the band as they reached the gates of Thelisama's spire, which much resembled a fragile crimson glass up close. For such a large and imposing fortification, the tower that stood before them appeared, for all the world, to lack the structural surety of stone and steel. Scarson was the first to attempt to press the gates open by force. He placed both of his hands against the apparently fragile mineral substance, and began to exert considerable might against it. Unfortunately, the red gates were not made from a weak crystal that would give way under a rough and firm hand, but from a much sturdier substance, reinforced many times over by dark magic. The chieftain did not struggle against the gates for more than an instant or two, before he realized that brute strength would avail him nothing here, even if he called the rest of his men over to assist in the effort. He cursed and addressed Kyrus as he stepped back and gazed watchfully out at the scarlet dunes around the company. Damnable sorcery! Witchman, have a look at this gate, and see if you can open it or blast it down with your magic. Scarson growled as he heard a distant scuttling noise amid the dunes coming closer. The sound of movement in the shadowy pits between the dunes had been a constant, but the noise had grown more plentiful and more organized. As the Elentrian approached the tower door of the rival sorcerer to inspect it in search of physical or metaphysical weaknesses, a dark shape, no larger than a man, clambered upon a dune roughly 50 yards from the rear line of the group. Then another, of the same dune, and then a third creature, from a dune only 10 yards to their right. The imps, illuminated by the pale light, did not attack any of the humans right away. They watched with dark, beady eyes that seemed to catch and reflect the ruby light from the tower, as more and more of their ilk began to amass, until the unsettling little beast numbered over a dozen, facing down the collection of 4 warriors, one of whom was already injured. "Witch, hurry up with that accursed door," Valif called out as he glanced back at the sorcerer who had taken out his dagger and began to scratch a sigil into the door, like an engraving. The youngest of the northern warriors was thoroughly unsettled by the beady-eyed and diminutive, yet profoundly unnatural specimens, whose mouths were twisted into a permanent open and wide smile that showed off the row upon row of needle-like teeth. In this, Valif was far from alone. The nomadic woman shuddered at the sight of the maws, so like the one that had wounded her arm the night prior. The fear did not stop her from drawing her concealed dagger hesitantly with the hand of her uninjured arm, nor did it stop Valif from assuming the closest thing he could manage to a fighting stance, with one arm in a sling and the other holding out his one-handed northern sword. The imps began to ponderously move forward together, making a strange, almost chittering noise amongst themselves. Kyrus briefly turned his head to look at the increasingly troubling situation, and made a request of Scarson as he continued carving on the red gates with his dagger. "Get me one of those things, would you? The largest would be preferable." The sorcerer needed blood to finish his spell to open the tower gate. He would soon receive it in one way or another, when the little beast's slow advance altered its pace to a frantic, skittering charge. The combat that followed was neither glorious nor particularly organized. Scarson and the three other unwounded warriors moved to take the brunt of the charge, and within the first few seconds of the contact at least one of the beasts was killed by each of the Northmen. Scarson bisected two with a single cleaving strike, and a shout of fury that would have rattled any natural creature, and indeed seemed to give the imps he was facing pause for a fraction of a second. The situation swiftly deteriorated when the surviving imps closed into hand-to-hand range and leaped like bobcats upon the mighty warriors, snarling and biting. In a struggle of one man against one or even two of the small, loathsome fiends, the warriors would have had no issue. But each was engaged wrestling with three or four of the beasts, which were deceptively strong. Valif was not idle as he began to hack furiously at the creatures who had lunged upon his companion who favored the spear, two of which were biting and clawing at him as he bashed the head of a third against a nearby rock. The mercenary's spear, useless for such close quarters grappling, had been dropped nearby. Scarson was faring the best against the imps, despite having initially been engaged with 6 of them. After cleaving through the first 2, he had torn out the throat of a third with his teeth, and hurled a fourth towards the gate by which their guide and sorcerer loitered, shouting as he tore away one imp that had bitten into his shoulder, and a fair bit of his own flesh was torn away with it. The creature that had been provided for Kyrus' spell crashed head first into the gate, and lay dazed but not dead for a moment, until both the warlock and the nomad fell upon it with their daggers. Between the panicked wild stabbing of the fearful nomad, and the more precise cut from Kyrus across its neck, the little monster did not survive long. As the nomadic woman dropped its lead and began to attack the prone creature, the ox carrying the water had finally managed to scarper away in the total disarray and confusion, and was a distant figure before anyone could even consider attempting to retrieve it. The frail sorcerer then enlisted the help of the nomad in lifting the creature, which was a bit more than half his own size, and pressing its bleeding throat against the sigil. The effect was instantaneous. The sturdy gates of the tower began to crack in a pattern reminiscent of a spider's web, then shattered and fell to the ground as harmless gem dust. Soon after the guide and Kyrus dropped the beast to the ground, the Northmen finished their bloody battle. The engagement had been brief, and none among their company had fallen. But there were also none among the warriors of Akal who were not now bloody and wounded, with gashes from claws and punctures from needle-like teeth. None the less, the men from the north who had staggered or fallen hauled themselves to their feet and began to climb the steps leading to the tower, following the sorcerer and their chieftain into the lair of Thel-Lassama, where their task would find its conclusion.